Joining us now is Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee and a former prosecutor. Senator Blumenthal, your reaction to Robert Mueller apparently agreeing to accept service of this subpoena to testify on July 17th.
There's no question this step is a major historic breakthrough. And I think in answer to your last question to the congressman, July 18th is going to be the beginning of a new day for America in understanding how the President of the United States committed acts of felony obstruction of justice. I was one of those federal prosecutors who wrote that the president would be in handcuffs doing a perp walk as a criminal defendant, but for his being a sitting president. And I think that the face and voice of Robert Mueller, in effect, the movie depicting the book, which most Americans won't read, will have a gripping, powerful effect on America as a whole, as well as on Congress.
Let's listen to what Robert Mueller said on that day a month ago when he spoke. And he talked about the Constitution requiring a process other than the indictment process to accuse a sitting president. Let's listen to that.
First, the opinion explicitly permits the investigation of a sitting president because it is important to preserve evidence while memories are fresh and documents available. Among other things, that evidence could be used if there were co-conspirators who could be charged now. And second, the opinion says that the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing.
And, Senator, as we saw, Robert Mueller was careful not to use the word impeachment that day, but he will be asked, in quoting that line, does he mean impeachment?
He will no doubt be asked about whether he was alluding to impeachment, and I think that 9-minute trailer to the movie, so to speak, his 9-minute statement, which was covered wall to wall on the day that he did it, illustrates how powerful his answer will be to that question. But remember, he also alluded to preserving evidence while memories are fresh and the documents still exist in connection with other criminal prosecutions. There are ongoing investigations in the Southern District of New York where the president's been named as an unindicted co-conspirator, and there's a possibility of his indictment after he finishes serving office. So the Mueller subtext here is varied and deep, and no question, he will be asked about it.
As I said to Rachel, one of the things I would want to know is why didn't you subpoena President Trump? That seems to me to be the kind of question that lives outside of the Mueller report. It's not mentioned in the Mueller report, but can be answered by Robert Mueller.
He certainly can answer it. Whether he will is another question. There are others as well. Why he didn't.
Can you, Senator, can I just ask you, can you, as a former prosecutor and a senator, can you think of any reason why Robert Mueller would not give a full and open answer to the question of why didn't you subpoena President Trump?
Here's what he may say. He may say that his answer would prejudice another proceeding and investigation alluding to the Southern District of New York. He may say that the litigation of Donald Trump's refusal to appear would have taken too long to resolve for his investigation to be completed in a timely way. He may say that he simply will not answer the question because of other considerations and leave it vague. I've watched Robert Mueller testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's fully capable of refusing to answer a question in a very polite and deferential way.
And, Senator, let me just get you, before you go on, there's a big development today on the emoluments case proceeding against the president, and you've been heavily involved in that as it's developed. Tell us about where that stands.
The emoluments case is Blumenthal versus Trump. That's the name of the case. I have led about 200 of my colleagues in suing the President of the United States because he has literally daily, since his inauguration, violated the preeminent anti-corruption clause of the United States Constitution, the Emoluments Clause, which forbids a president from receiving benefits or payments from a foreign power or entity. And what we won today was the right to go forward with obtaining documents relating to his financial affairs, because they are relevant to determining, in fact, how he's violated the Emoluments Clause. We've already won motions to dismiss our case based on our supposed lack of standing. The Emoluments Clause itself, the courts rejected them, and today it rejected the president's effort to delay, to stonewall, to slow walk, and our hope is that the Court of Appeals will agree with the district court, which ruled today in our favor. It's a really historic ruling, and I think that we need to keep the wheels of justice moving.
Senator Richard Blumenthal, thank you very much for joining us on this breaking news tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.